"We're terminating you effective immediately. Security will escort you out." She said it without even looking up from her brand new company laptop, still halfway through logging into her Slack account for the first time. The CEO's daughter-in-law, day one, office one, me sitting there like I was some junior employee who'd screwed up the coffee order. Here's what she didn't know: I owned 74% of the company. Matthew Stone, 47 years old, former Marine intelligence officer who'd spent the last 22 years quietly buying up shares while everyone else was playing office politics and measuring their success in fancy titles. No handshake, no explanation. Just a trembling junior HR rep standing behind her like he was watching someone defuse a bomb with a butter knife. Ink on her onboarding packet was still wet, and she was already playing executioner. Sophia Warren had her blonde hair and that high ponytail thing, her resume printed on thick cream paper that probably cost more than most people's lunch, and her MBA confidence pumped up like a bouncy castle at a kid's birthday party. She didn't ask questions, didn't even blink. Just read the line off her iPad, word for word. You could tell someone had coached her, probably her husband or her father-in-law, or maybe she'd practiced in the mirror until she got that cold CEO voice just right. I didn't flinch or argue. Old Marine training kicks in at moments like this. I stood up, straightened my tie, habit from the core. You never let them see you rattled, and handed over my badge with the kind of calm precision you learn after 22 years of swallowing corporate nonsense and grinding through boardroom power games where everyone thinks they're Napoleon. She thought she was firing me. Thought this was her first big executive decision. All I said was, "I want to handle this properly. Tell your father-in-law the emergency board meeting in 2 hours should be interesting." Then I walked out, past the silent HR guy who looked like he wanted to disappear into the carpet, past the security guard who seemed more confused than concerned, probably wondering why they needed to escort out some middle-aged guy in a suit who was acting calmer than most people ordering coffee. Past that big framed photo of the founding family in the lobby that, funny enough, left out the woman who actually wrote the legal framework they built their whole empire on. 2 hours. That's all the time she had between her first firing and her first complete disaster. Now, while I've got your attention, if this already sounds like the kind of corporate chaos that makes you want to grab popcorn, hit that subscribe button. Not because I'm desperate for likes, but because stories like this don't surface every day. And you'd be surprised how often the person getting walked out is actually the one who holds all the cards. Back to our regularly scheduled meltdown. In those 2 hours, I imagine Sophia celebrated. Maybe popped open some champagne in her corner office, my old office if we're being technical about it. Maybe started drafting one of those LinkedIn posts about tough decisions and strategic leadership with hashtags like new leadership, tough choices, corporate life. You know the type. Meanwhile, I was already 3 moves ahead. See, there's something called the Silent Partner Protection Protocol buried in our original shareholder agreement. Sounds fancy, right? It's basically a legal landmine I planted 20 years ago after watching too many family businesses get destroyed by people who confuse their last name with actual qualifications. The protocol says if any executive gets fired by someone who doesn't own equity, and that firing happens without a board vote, then boom, all executive authority gets suspended immediately. Board has to meet within 2 hours. All voting control goes back to the majority shareholder. That would be me, while she was probably picking out new office furniture and figuring out how to get her parking spot upgraded. I was filing the protocol activation. Timestamped, notarized, couriered to every board member, investor, and lawyer connected to this company. Unlike her welcome packet with its typos and coffee stains, mine came with legal authentication that could hold up in federal court. She figured I'd just slink away quietly. Most people would. But here's what you learn in military intelligence: never build something you can't protect. And I didn't spend 22 years building this company just to watch some entitled kid with fresh dental work tear it apart because daddy-in-law thought blood was thicker than competence. There's a reason my name doesn't show up in the company brochures or on the fancy leadership team page of our website. I was the ghost in the machine. The insurance policy. The guy you called when the lights were off and the SEC was sniffing around asking uncomfortable questions about where all that money went. I never wanted the spotlight. Spotlight gets you targeted. I wanted control, real control. The kind that comes from actually owning the thing, instead of just sitting in the big chair and pretending you're important. While other people were collecting fancy business cards in corner offices, I was collecting percentages. Half a point here, a full point there. Equity instead of bonuses, voting shares instead of parking spots. Every time we closed a deal or brought in new investors, I'd negotiate another slice, quiet, professional, like a sniper picking targets. Most people play poker with their careers. I built the casino and printed my own chips. It all started back when this place was basically 2 folding chairs, a whiteboard with marker stains, and a founder who thought compliance was something that happened to other people. Richard Warren was what you'd call a visionary. the kind who could see the big picture, but couldn't remember if he'd paid the electric bill or accidentally wired 6 figures to some random account in Delaware. I was fresh out of the Marines then, 25 years old with an intelligence background and exactly zero patience for corporate chaos. Most guys my age were chasing quick promotions and flashy titles. I looked around and saw a company that was one audit away from federal investigation and thought this could either blow up spectacularly or make someone very rich. Might as well be me. Richard needed someone who could actually read contracts without falling asleep. Someone who understood that when the IRS comes knocking, you don't hide under your desk and hope they go away. Someone who knew the difference between creative accounting and plain old fraud. That someone turned out to be me. So when he offered me some VP title with a corner office and business cards that probably cost more per piece than most people's lunch, I said thanks but no thanks. Give me equity instead. Ownership. A real piece of the action, not just a fancy nameplate that could disappear the moment someone younger and cheaper walked through the door. You'd rather own a piece of the foundation than sit in the penthouse, he said, like it was some kind of joke. Exactly, I told him and I meant it. See, here's what I learned in military intelligence: titles are just noise. Real power comes from information, leverage, and being smart enough to see 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still figuring out the rules of the game. Richard thought he was being generous, offering me 3% equity for basically saving his company from bankruptcy. I thought I was getting the deal of a lifetime. By year 3, I was sitting on 18%. Not bad for a former jarhead who'd never taken a business class in his life. But I wasn't done, not even close. Year 8 rolls around and our CFO, this guy named Harold, who wore bow ties and thought expense reports were suggestions rather than requirements, gets into a screaming match with Richard over some misallocated funds. Long story short, Harold's idea of fiscal responsibility was treating the company account like his personal piggy bank. When the lawyers got involved and the divorce papers started flying, guess who needed to liquidate his shares fast? That would be Harold. And guess who was ready with cash and a willingness to keep certain discoveries out of the court filings? That would be me. 41% ownership, just like that. Still flying under the radar, still letting Richard think he was running the show, still making sure the trains ran on time while everyone else played grab-ass in the boardroom. But the real jackpot came in year 15. Richard's brother, let's call him the black sheep of the Warren family, decided he deserved a bigger piece of the pie. Started making noise about hostile takeovers, claiming Richard had screwed him out of his rightful inheritance, threatening to air every piece of dirty laundry this family had been hiding since the Reagan administration. Most companies would have folded. The legal fees alone could have bankrupted us. The publicity would have sent our biggest clients running for the hills. But here's the thing about having a former Marine intelligence officer on your team. We know how to gather information, and we know how to use it properly. Turns out dear old Uncle Warren had been running some creative offshore arrangements that would have made the Panama Papers look like a church newsletter. Nothing technically illegal, mind you, but the kind of stuff that makes IRS agents wake up in cold sweats and start planning their retirement around the size of their next big score. So when settlement time came around, Uncle Warren was feeling very cooperative, very reasonable. Very interested in making this whole messy situation disappear as quietly and permanently as possible. The deal was simple. I take his 31% ownership stake, he gets a bulletproof non-disclosure agreement, and a promise that certain financial documents would never see the light of day. Everyone walks away happy. Well, everyone except Uncle Warren, but he'd made his own bet on that one. 74% majority ownership. 3/4 of a company that was now pulling in serious money and showing up on industry companies to watch lists. Not bad for someone who started out just trying to keep the lights on and the feds from asking too many questions. But here's the kicker. Nobody knew. Richard still thought he was the king of his little corporate castle. The board still treated him like the visionary founder who could do no wrong. The trade magazine still ran puff pieces about his brilliant leadership and innovative strategies. Meanwhile, I was the guy in the back room making sure the numbers added up and the regulatory paperwork got filed on time. That's when I wrote the Silent Partner Protection Protocol. Call it insurance, call it paranoia. Call it the natural result of watching too many family businesses get destroyed by people who confused DNA with talent. But after seeing what Uncle Warren almost did to us, I wasn't taking any chances on the next entitled relative who thought blood ties trumped basic competence. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity. Any executive termination by a non-equity holder without board approval triggers immediate suspension of all executive authority. Emergency board meeting gets called. Voting control reverts to majority shareholder. That would be me pending review. It was like a dead man switch for corporate governance. I buried it deep in the shareholder agreement, right between the standard boilerplate about dividend distributions and stock transfer restrictions. Most lawyers would skim right past it. Most board members would never bother reading that far into the fine print. But it was there, locked and loaded, waiting for someone stupid enough to pull the trigger. 22 years of careful planning. 22 years of keeping my mouth shut and letting other people take the credit while I built an empire they didn't even know existed. And today, some fresh-faced MBA with a trust fund and daddy issues just stepped right into my trap. The call came while Richard was out at Pebblebrook Country Club, probably on the back nine, telling his golf buddies about how he was grooming the next generation of leadership. You know how these old-school CEOs love their golf? It's where they make their real deals and decide who's in and who's out over priced scotch and stories about the good old days. When his phone started buzzing for the third time, he finally picked up. His general counsel, Walter Gibson, wasn't calling to chat about weekend plans. "I need you back at headquarters immediately," Walter said, and you could hear that tone lawyers get when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin someone's entire year. Emergency situation. She signed something she shouldn't have. Richard didn't even finish his round. Left his golf cart sitting on the fairway, probably broke some country club etiquette rule that would get him blackballed from the weekend tournaments. But when your company lawyer calls with that particular flavor of panic in his voice, you drop everything and move. 20 minutes later, which had to be some kind of land speed record for a guy who usually needed 2 assistants just to find his car keys, Richard was storming through our lobby looking like someone had told him his yacht was on fire. Walter was waiting with the kind of expression undertakers wear when they're about to discuss payment plans. Our CFO, Diana Foster, was there too, along with one very pale HR assistant who looked like she was seriously considering a career change. The conference room was half full of board members who dropped whatever important thing they were doing to show up for what they thought was going to be a routine emergency meeting. Routine? That's funny. Walter didn't waste time with small talk or corporate pleasantries. Just opened up his leather portfolio, the expensive kind that probably cost more than most people's car payments, and started reading like he was delivering a court verdict. Per the Silent Partner Protection Protocol, Section 7, subsection C of the original shareholder agreement, he began in that flat lawyer voice that sucks all the oxygen out of a room. Any executive termination carried out by a non-equity appointee without prior board authorization shall result in immediate revocation of all interim leadership authority, suspension of executive appointments made within the previous 48 hours, and automatic transfer of operational control to the majority shareholder pending emergency board review. You should have seen Richard's face. Guy went from country club tan to morgue pale in about 3 seconds. Like someone had just explained to him that his entire life was actually an elaborate practical joke and everyone else was in on it. Who authorized the termination? He asked. And you could hear his voice starting to crack around the edges. Nobody answered, which was an answer all by itself. Who signed off on firing my senior advisor? He tried again, louder this time, with that desperate edge people get when they already know the answer and really don't want it to be true. Diana cleared her throat and looked down at her tablet like it contained nuclear launch codes. The HR assistant looked like she was about to throw up all over her nice corporate outfit. Finally, Walter delivered the news that was going to change everything. Your daughter-in-law, acting alone, no board consultation, no equity position, no legal authority to terminate corporate officers. The silence that followed was the kind you get in movies right before someone's entire world collapses. Richard sat down hard in his chair, like someone had cut his strings. She doesn't have that kind of authority, he said, but he said it like someone trying to convince himself of something he knew wasn't true. Correct. Walter said with the kind of professional sympathy lawyers reserve for clients who are about to get very expensive legal bills. She never did. Her appointment as Chief Strategy Officer was ceremonial derivative authority only. Under the protocol, her unilateral action constitutes a breach of corporate governance. Here's where it gets interesting. Richard started doing that thing desperate people do when they realize they've made a mistake that can't be unmade. He started bargaining. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said, loosening his tie like it was choking him. "I'll talk to her. We'll rescind the termination. Make it right." Walter shook his head with the kind of patience you'd use to explain to a child why they can't have ice cream for breakfast. There is no rescind option in the protocol. The safeguard is active. Documentation was filed before the termination was executed. Time-stamped, notarized, distributed to all shareholders and investors. You have exactly 47 minutes before the emergency board meeting is required to convene. But she's family. Richard tried one more time, like blood relationship was some kind of magic shield against legal consequences. "She's not shareholding family," Walter said, and that distinction hit like a hammer on glass. "And according to our IT department, She's currently in your former advisor's office asking how to access the corporate credit cards and change our mission statement. That's when Richard really understood what had happened. His face went through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds: confusion, disbelief, rage, fear, and finally that sick recognition that comes when you realize you've been outplayed by someone you completely underestimated. "What do we do now?" he asked, and for the first time since I'd known him, Richard Warren sounded like what he really was, a tired old man who just discovered that the family member he trusted with his legacy was about as qualified to run a company as a golden retriever with impulse control issues. Walter closed his portfolio with the kind of finality you hear when a judge drops his gavel. You sit in that boardroom. You listen to what the majority shareholder has to say. You do not interrupt, you do not argue, and you remember that he owns 3/4 of everything you think is yours. At exactly 3 p.m., I walked into that boardroom like I was reporting for duty. Same black suit I'd worn to 1,000 meetings before, pressed and professional. Not flashy, not trying to make some grand entrance. Just a guy who knew exactly where he belonged. The room went dead quiet. Even Sophia stopped playing with her fancy pen and looked up like she'd just noticed the temperature had dropped about 20 degrees. I didn't sit down. Didn't ask permission, just walked straight to the head of the table, the spot Richard hadn't touched since this whole mess started, and placed my leather folder down with the kind of precision they teach you in the military. As majority shareholder, I said in the same tone I used to brief commanding officers back when I wore different uniforms, I'm calling for an immediate vote to rescind all executive appointments made in the last 48 hours pending full board review. Those words hit the room like a flashbang grenade. You could literally watch the reality sink in as each person did the math and realized what they were actually dealing with. This wasn't some disgruntled middle manager making noise. This was the guy who owned the place, and he was done playing games. George Pemberton, the board chairman, old school business guy who'd seen every kind of corporate drama you could imagine, cleared his throat and managed to keep his voice steady. Motion received and entered into the record. We'll proceed with the vote. Richard still couldn't look at me, just stared at the conference table like he was trying to burn a hole through it with his eyes. His golden boy moment had turned into a complete nightmare, and you could see him aging about 10 years in real time. Sophia looked like she needed medical attention. All that MBA confidence had evaporated faster than morning fog. And now she was just a young woman who'd wandered into a corporate version of a minefield with a blindfold on. The vote was a formality. When you own 74% of something, democracy becomes pretty straightforward. But we went through the motions anyway, because that's how you do things properly. No shortcuts, no corner cutting, everything by the book. 20 minutes later, it was over. Sophia Warren, former chief strategy officer for exactly 1 day, was officially unemployed again. But I wasn't done yet. Richard and I ended up in the small side conference room, just the two of us having the kind of conversation that changes everything. I slid 2 pieces of paper across the table between us. Left side, a buyout offer, clean and simple. He could purchase my 74% stake for 15 times current market valuation, enough money to buy his own island somewhere if he wanted to disappear and pretend this whole thing never happened. Right side, reorganization terms. I stay as majority owner and executive chairman, complete corporate restructuring, new management team, professional standards. No more family appointments unless they could actually do the job. Richard stared at both papers like they were written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked, and his voice sounded like it was coming from someone about 20 years older than the guy who'd been bragging about his golf game that morning. 24 hours, I said. After that, the reorganization happens with or without your cooperation. He picked up the buyout offer and held it like it might explode in his hands. You'd really walk away from all this, just like that. I built it once, I said. I can build it again, but I won't watch it get destroyed by people who think DNA is a business qualification. 3 days later, Richard took the buyout, sold me his remaining shares, and announced his retirement to pursue other interests. Translation: he was getting out before the new management started asking uncomfortable questions about how things had been running around here. Sophia never came back to the building. Heard through the grapevine that she was telling people I'd stolen the company from her family, which would be funny if it wasn't so far from reality. You can't steal something you already own. 6 months later, the company was running smoother than it had in years. New CFO who actually understood that expense reports weren't suggestions. New legal team that knew the difference between creative accounting and fraud. New corporate policies that said family connections got you exactly nothing unless you could prove you deserved to be there. I kept the executive chairman title in the corner office that had technically been mine all along. Put my name on the building directory for the first time in 22 years. Not because I needed the ego boost, but because sometimes you have to remind people who's actually in charge. The best part? 3 months after the reorganization, we landed the biggest contract in company history. Turns out, clients prefer doing business with companies that have their act together instead of ones that hand out executive positions like party favors to relatives who can't tell a profit margin from a pizza margin. Richard sent me a postcard from his new place in Florida, just a picture of a golf course and a note that said, "Thanks for the wake-up call." No hard feelings, which I respected. Takes a certain kind of man to admit when he's screwed up and move on without making everyone else miserable about it. As for Sophia, last I heard, she was working for some startup in Silicon Valley, probably telling her new coworkers about the time she almost ran a major corporation for a whole day before getting ousted by corporate politics. Whatever helps her sleep at night. Look, if you've made it this far, you probably recognize something in this story. Maybe you've worked for companies where the boss's kid got promoted over people who actually knew what they were doing. Maybe you've watched qualified people get pushed aside because they didn't have the right last name or didn't play golf at the right country club. Maybe you've been that qualified person. Here's what I learned from 22 years of building something real while other people played dress up with fancy titles. Competence always wins in the end. It might take time, it might require patience you didn't know you had. But real ability beats inherited privilege every single time. The market doesn't care about your family tree, it cares about results. So the next time some entitled person tries to push you around because they think their connections make them untouchable, remember this story. Sometimes the quiet person in the back of the room is the one who actually owns the place. And sometimes justice is just a matter of reading the fine print.